Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and uncover a pretty shocking reality about our ancestors. Honestly, it's going to completely shatter how you view your grueling modern routine. Imagine waking up just whenever your body is naturally ready. No alarm blaring, no stressful commute. You just stretch and ask yourself, well, what should I do today? For 99% of human history, that wasn't some fantasy vacation scenario. That was literally every single morning for roughly 300,000 years. And the answer to that daily question looked absolutely nothing like the life you and I are living right now. 90,000. Think about that number for a second. Modern humans spend roughly 90,000 hours of our lives working. You're dedicating a full one-third of your waking existence to a job, very often just to survive. But here's the crazy part. For the overwhelming majority of human history, jobs didn't even exist. There was absolutely no employment, no hourly wages, no boss checking in on you, and definitely no corporate ladder to climb. So, what did people actually do with all of that time? Well, contrast our 90,000 hours with this. For 99% of human history, people spent only about 17 hours a week acquiring food. 17 hours. And again, with absolutely no jobs or bosses in sight. Just let that sink in. That leaves a massive, gaping hole of free time in a typical week, especially when you compare it to the 40, 50, or even 60 hours we so furiously log today. So, how do we know this for sure? Well, we know it thanks to a truly groundbreaking study. Back in 1963, an archaeologist named Richard Lee actually went out and tracked the daily activities of the Doju Hansi people in Botswana. Now, they are one of the very few remaining groups still living in a way that closely resembles pre-agricultural human life. And his research revealed something incredible. Adults spent merely 2.5 days a week on actual survival. The rest of the time, they literally just did whatever they wanted. And look, the really crucial point here is that this 15 to 20-hour survival week, it's definitely not just some isolated anomaly. It shows up everywhere anthropologists look, across completely different continents and entirely different environments. We're talking from the Hadza in Tanzania over to the Akar in Paraguay, all the way to the Martooth in Australia. Different climates, different landscapes, but the exact same result. About 15 to 20 hours a week spent on survival activities. To put that in perspective, you probably work twice that much in just a couple of days. Right now, you might be asking yourself, okay, sure, those are modern groups, but how do we know ancient prehistoric humans actually lived with this much free time? It's a completely fair question, and the undeniable answer is actually etched right into their bones. When archaeologists compare the skeletons of ancient hunter-gatherers to early agricultural farming populations, the contrast is just dramatic. Hunter-gatherers were tall, strong, had incredibly healthy teeth, and showed very little joint damage. Early farmers, on the other hand, they were shorter, their bones showed clear nutritional deficiencies, their teeth were absolutely riddled with cavities from grain-heavy diets, and they suffered from intense arthritis in their spines from all that brutal, repetitive labor. Oh, and they died younger. So their bones tell a crystal clear story. Ancient humans were doing way less repetitive physical labor, not more. And, this massive amount of free time is brilliantly illustrated by ancient art and culture. This level of creativity simply shouldn't exist if survival was a constant, all-consuming struggle, right? 30,000 years ago in Chauvet Cave, France, someone painted stunningly sophisticated horses and lions by firelight. 40,000 years ago in Germany, someone carefully carved a vulture bone into a perfectly pitched 5-hole flute. They spent hours, maybe even days, deep in caves or crafting complex instruments. Not for food, not for defense, but just for beauty, for music, because they actually had the time to do it. Actually, my absolute favorite example of this is from Blombos Cave down in South Africa. Archaeologists found these 100,000-year-old perforated shell beads. Now, the nearest coastline was 20 kilometers away. That means someone walked a 40-kilometer round trip just to collect seashells and then spent hours incredibly carefully drilling tiny holes through them with primitive stone tools. It was completely meant for jewelry, literally just to look good. Ancient humans clearly had massive amounts of time to focus on creating beauty and meaning that had absolutely no immediate practical benefit. So let's jump into Section 1, an ancient daily routine, a day in the life without jobs. Okay, so what did a typical day actually look like before the concept of employment, schedules, or annoying alarms were ever even a thing? Well, you wake up around dawn, breakfast is some leftover meat or berries, and it's highly social. Then, by mid morning, you might head out for some persistence hunting. This is where humans uniquely used our weird ability to sweat to jog after animals at a steady pace for, say, 3 to 6 hours. Most animals can't sweat, so we simply outlasted them until the prey overheated and just collapsed. It wasn't some frantic, dangerous movie chase scene. It was just a methodical jog taking up maybe half the day. If you break down a typical 24-hour day, it reveals something totally amazing. By early afternoon, that 4 to 6 hours of securing food and making tools, it was totally done. The quote-unquote productive part of the day was entirely over. So what happens next? Well, you've got about 6 hours of social interaction, 8 hours of sleep, and just huge open blocks of time for resting, sitting in the shade, watching the clouds, and honestly, just existing without needing to justify your existence through nonstop productivity. You probably noticed that massive 6-hour chunk dedicated just to social interaction. Anthropologist James Sussman noted they spent that time socializing, talking, and grooming each other for a very specific, practical reason. In a world completely without money or police or written contracts, your survival depends entirely on your relationships. If people don't like you, they simply don't have to share their food with you when you're hungry. So you invest enormous amounts of time in those bonds. It's fundamentally how humans stay human. But when the sun set, things got really magical, honestly. Anthropologist Polly Weissner analyzed hundreds of hours of their conversations. During the day, the chatting was highly practical, tracking animals or maybe complaining about someone not sharing properly. But at night, around the fire, a staggering 81% of conversations shifted to stories, grand myths about how the world began, and jokes. This nighttime social space is literally where human culture, gods, spirits, and our shared history were born. Those are things you can only really think about when you're full, you're safe, and you actually have the time. And then, when it was finally time to rest, they didn't just crash for one forced 8-hour block like we're always trying to do today. Before artificial light, humans naturally slept in these two distinct phases. There was a first sleep of about 4 hours, followed by a wakeful period of 1 to 2 hours in complete darkness. This time was used for quiet reflection, talking, or maybe stoking the fire. Then they'd go into a second sleep for another 4 hours. Today, we wake up at 2 a.m. and panic, calling it insomnia. For them, it was just a completely natural, peaceful part of the daily rhythm. Which brings us to Section 2, the agricultural trap, how 10,000 years ago changed absolutely everything. So you have to ask, where did this incredibly leisurely, natural existence go wrong? Well, it vanished roughly 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, when humanity fell into what's basically a giant demographic trap. We started planting seeds and domesticating animals to feed more people. And because there's suddenly more food, the population rapidly explodes. But here's the catch. Because you now have so many extra mouths to feed, you can no longer survive just by hunting and gathering. You're permanently locked in. Communities became trapped in endless, brutal farming labor just to sustain those soaring population numbers. This whole agricultural shift triggered a devastating cascade of new burdens. Suddenly, life meant relentless plowing, planting, weeding, and harvesting. You had to physically store and fiercely defend your crops from wild animals and raiders. As these populations inevitably grew into cities, we saw the rise of specialists, soldiers, priests, administrators, and eventually this birthed the modern concept of employment. It was the absolute invention of the idea that your time belonged to someone else in exchange for the resources you needed to survive. So by the time we started building actual cities, that original, deeply human lifestyle was just gone. It was replaced entirely by schedules, obligations, and the desperate, constant need to work most of your waking hours. Essentially, we made a massive trade. We completely traded our inherent freedom for food security. We gave up our natural leisure time in exchange for skyrocketing population growth and eventually industrial productivity. We live so drastically differently from how we actually evolved to live, we might as well be a completely different species. Which leaves us with one final, really provocative thought to wrap up this explainer. We spent our entire lives chasing this illusion of wealth and success, but entirely by standards society just invented recently. So you have to ask yourself, are you working 90,000 hours just to retire into the exact same peaceful, self-directed life your ancient ancestors already woke up to every single morning? They didn't need to quote unquote become successful. They were already living the exact life you're working your entire existence to earn. Definitely something to think about tomorrow morning when that alarm goes off. Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer. I really hope it shifts how you look at your day.